February 10, 1990. Las Cruces, New Mexico. A small city near the Mexican border where everyone knew everyone, where crime was mostly petty theft and the occasional bar fight. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where children played outside until dark, where Saturday mornings meant youth bowling leagues and families spending time together at the local bowling alley. Las Cruces Bowl on East Amador Avenue opened at 9 that morning. By 9:30 a.m., the building held 12 people. 7 were children, ranging from age 2 to 13. The others were adults, there for the morning shift or dropping kids off for bowling league practice. None of them knew that in the next 15 minutes, their lives would be forever changed. That Las Cruces Bowl was about to become the site of one of New Mexico's most brutal unsolved crimes. That 4 people would be dead. That survivors would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And that despite thousands of tips, extensive investigations, and decades of effort, the person or persons responsible would never be caught. This is the story of the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre. A crime so shocking it's hard to believe it happened in broad daylight. So violent it seemed impossible that children could survive. And so mysterious that after more than 30 years, we still don't know who did it or why. Understanding this case means understanding who was there that morning. Stephanie Senak, 34 years old, was the bowling alley's cook and manager on duty. She'd worked there for years. Single mother to her daughter Melissa, age 12, and Paula, age 6, dedicated to her job and her kids. Known in the community as friendly, hardworking, reliable. Melissa Repaski, Stephanie's 12-year-old daughter, was at the alley that morning. Smart, athletic, a good student. She was there helping her mother before bowling practice started. Stephen Turan, 26, was Stephanie's boyfriend. He was cooking in the kitchen that morning, helping Stephanie prepare food for the day ahead. A mechanic by trade, he was working the shift to spend time with Stephanie. Paula Holguin, 6 years old, Stephanie's younger daughter. Too young for bowling league, but there because her mother was working, playing in the office area, coloring, being a typical 6-year-old on a Saturday morning. Amy Hauser, 13, was there for bowling practice. Melissa's friend, an 8th grader with her whole life ahead of her. Valerie Turan, age 2, was Stephen's daughter from a previous relationship. Too young to understand what was happening. Just a toddler who'd come with her father to work. Ida Holguin, 26, worked at the bowling alley's day care center. Paula's mother, Stephanie's sister. She'd arrived early to set up for the children who'd be dropped off later. And there were others. Young bowlers arriving for practice. Adults in the office handling Saturday morning administrative work. 12 people total. 12 lives that intersected on that February morning in ways they could never have anticipated. At approximately 9:20 a.m., a man walked into Las Cruces Bowl. Witnesses who survived would later describe him as tall, slender, possibly Hispanic or light-skinned black. He wore a gray sweatshirt with the word guys or Gus on it, dark pants. He looked like he could be in his late 20s or early 30s. Nothing about him immediately screamed danger. He walked in like a customer, like someone who might be there to bowl or meet friends. Nobody paid him much attention. The bowling alley was preparing to open fully. People were busy with their tasks. The man walked toward the office area, toward the back of the building where the safe was kept, where Stephanie Senak was doing paperwork and counting money from the previous night's deposits, where children were playing and waiting for bowling practice to start. Then he pulled out a gun, a .22 caliber firearm. Investigators would later determine from the bullets recovered. He pointed it at Stephanie Senak and ordered everyone into the office, ordered them to lie down on the floor. His voice was calm, almost businesslike. This was a robbery, people assumed. Give him the money and he'd leave. That's how these things worked. You cooperated, you survived. So they cooperated. 7 children and 5 adults lay down on the floor of that small office, frightened but compliant, believing that compliance would save them. They were wrong. What happened next transformed a robbery into a massacre. The gunman had the safe opened, Had the money. Over $5,000 in cash, according to police estimates. He had what he came for. He could have left, should have left. Instead, he made everyone stay on the floor. Then he started shooting, methodically, one by one. He shot Stephanie Senak in the head. She fell unconscious immediately. He shot Stephen Turan in the head. Direct execution-style shot. Stephen died instantly. He shot Melissa Repaski, 12 years old, in the head. The bullet entered her skull, but incredibly, she survived. He shot Amy Hauser, 13, in the head. She too survived, though the bullet caused devastating damage. He shot Ida Holguin in the head. She survived but would be forever changed. He shot Paula Holguin, 6 years old, a child. Shot her in the head like the others. She survived. He shot Valerie Turan, 2 years old, toddler. Shot her in the head. She survived. The other children and adults in the room were shot as well, some multiple times. The sound of gunfire echoed through the bowling alley. The smell of gunpowder filled the small office. Blood spread across the floor where people lay. And through it all, the gunman was calm, methodical, taking his time, making sure each shot was deliberate. This wasn't panic. This wasn't self-defense. This was execution. Multiple survivors reported that there was a second person involved. A lookout or accomplice who stayed near the entrance while the shooting occurred. Descriptions varied. Some said it was another man younger than the shooter. Others weren't certain. The chaos and terror made clear observation difficult. But several witnesses were adamant. There were 2 people involved in this crime. The second person never entered the office area where the shooting happened. Never fired a weapon that investigators could determine. But his presence suggested this was planned, coordinated. 2 people working together to rob a bowling alley on a Saturday morning and then, for reasons still unknown, deciding to execute everyone inside. After the shooting stopped, both men fled, ran out of the bowling alley, possibly into a waiting vehicle, and disappeared into Las Cruces. Within minutes, emergency calls started coming in. People who'd heard the shots. Employees from nearby businesses who'd seen men running. And the first responders who arrived at Las Cruces Bowl found a scene of carnage that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. For people dead or dying. 8 wounded, many critically. Children lying in pools of blood. And 2 gunmen who'd vanished into a city of less than 70,000 people as if they'd never existed. The first 911 call came at 9:22 a.m. A witness reported hearing gunshots from Las Cruces Bowl. Police and emergency medical services responded within minutes. What they found was beyond anything they'd trained for. Las Cruces was a small city. Officers knew the bowling alley. Some had children who bowled there. Walking into that office and seeing what had happened, seeing children shot in the head, seeing the amount of blood, it broke something in even the most experienced first responders. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize survivors. The wounded were transported to Memorial Medical Center in Las Cruces. The most critical cases were later airlifted to larger hospitals in El Paso, Texas, just 45 miles south. Stephen Turan was already dead at the scene. Stephanie Senak died later that day from her wounds. Her daughters Paula and Melissa survived, though both suffered traumatic brain injuries that would affect them for life. Amy Hauser survived but lost an eye and suffered permanent brain damage from the bullet that entered her skull. Valerie Turan, just 2 years old, survived being shot in the head. The resilience of children, doctors said. Their skulls are softer, more forgiving. The bullet passed through in a way that, while causing damage, didn't kill her. Ida Holguin survived as well, though she would have no memory of the attack. The brain trauma erased those moments. Perhaps a mercy. The crime scene was secured. Detectives from the Las Cruces Police Department began processing evidence immediately. This was the biggest case the department had ever handled. The most violent, the most urgent. They needed to find who did this before they struck again. Lead Detective Steve Gallegos took charge of the case. He'd been with Las Cruces PD for years, but nothing had prepared him for this. The evidence collection was meticulous. Bullet casings were recovered. Fingerprints were lifted. Witness statements were taken from survivors and from people in the area. The crime scene told a story of calculated violence. The shooter hadn't panicked, hadn't fired wildly. Each shot was aimed, deliberate. The .22 caliber weapon was a choice too. Small caliber, relatively quiet, less likely to be heard outside the building. Someone who knew guns had chosen that weapon. The safe had been opened properly, not forced, suggesting the gunman had made Stephanie open it or knew the combination. The money was gone, over $5,000, possibly more. But the amount didn't match the violence. You don't execute 12 people, 4 of them fatally, for $5,000. Not unless you're trying to eliminate witnesses, or unless there was another motive entirely. Witnesses described the main gunman's clothing. The gray sweatshirt with Guys or Gus on it became a key detail. Police searched for anyone in Las Cruces who owned such a sweatshirt, checked local stores that might have sold it, put out public appeals for information. The description of the gunman was released. Composite sketches were created based on survivor accounts, posted throughout Las Cruces and surrounding areas. Tips started coming in immediately, people calling to report suspicious neighbors, ex-boyfriends, anyone who might fit the description. Each tip was investigated, each lead followed, but nothing concrete emerged. The gunman had disappeared as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. As the investigation progressed, theories about motive emerged. Theory 1. This was a robbery that went wrong. The gunman had intended to rob the bowling alley, take the money, and leave. But something happened. Maybe someone recognized them. Maybe they panicked. So they decided to eliminate witnesses. But this theory had problems. The shooting was too methodical for panic, too calm, and the amount of money didn't justify the risk. Theory 2. This was personal. Someone had a grudge against Stephanie Senac or Stephen Turan. The robbery was a cover. The real motive was murder. Investigators looked into both victims' backgrounds. Stephanie had no known enemies, was well-liked in the community. Stephen was relatively new to Las Cruces. A mechanic, quiet guy, no obvious conflicts. But they dug deeper, looked at relationships, financial records, any connection that might explain targeted violence. Found nothing definitive. Theory 3. This was connected to drugs. Las Cruces' proximity to the Mexican border made it a corridor for drug trafficking. Maybe the bowling alley was involved somehow. Maybe Stephanie or Stephen had gotten mixed up in something. Maybe the shooting was a message. But again, no evidence supported this. No drugs were found. No connection to cartels or dealers. It was speculation without substance. Theory 4. This was random violence. The gunman chose the bowling alley because it was an easy target. The execution-style shootings were to eliminate witnesses. The brutality was simply who these men were. Psychopaths capable of shooting children in the head without remorse. This theory was perhaps the most terrifying because it meant the killers could strike again anywhere, anytime, against anyone. As survivors recovered enough to give detailed statements, a clearer picture emerged. Melissa Repaski, 12 years old, had been shot in the head but survived with her cognitive functions largely intact. She remembered the gunman's face, worked with police to create the composite sketch, described his movements, his voice, the cold calculation with which he'd shot everyone. Her testimony was crucial, but it was also traumatic. Reliving those moments, describing watching her mother die, knowing she'd been shot but couldn't remember the actual moment of impact. Just before and after, the gap where the bullet entered her brain. Amy Hauser remembered less. The brain injury had affected her memory, but she remembered the fear, the realization that this wasn't just a robbery, the sound of shots, the pain. She'd lost her right eye.
Suffrait permanent cognitive imperme.
Would struggle for years with the trauma. Paula Holguin was only 6, too young to give detailed testimony. She remembered a bad man with a gun, remembered pain and fear. Being in the hospital, her mother and sister crying. but the specifics were lost in the way a young child's memory works. Perhaps another mercy. Ida Holguin remembered nothing of the shooting itself. Her last memory was arriving at work. Her next memory was waking in a hospital, being told she'd been shot, that her sister Stephanie was dead. The gap between contained the worst moments of her life, and her brain had erased them. Valerie Turan, 2 years old, would have no memory of any of it. Would grow up knowing only what she was told, that her father had been murdered, that she'd been shot as a toddler, that she'd survived something most people couldn't imagine. These survivors became the faces of the case. Their recovery and resilience a testament to human endurance, but also a reminder that even when you survive, you never truly escape. Las Cruces was a tight-knit community. The bowling alley massacre shattered the city's sense of safety. Parents kept children home from school. Businesses installed better security. People bought guns, installed alarm systems, became suspicious of strangers. The fear was palpable. If this could happen on a Saturday morning at a family bowling alley, it could happen anywhere. Vigils were held for the victims. Stephanie Senak and Stephen Turan were mourned. Funds were established for the survivors' medical care. The hospital bills were staggering. Brain surgery, rehabilitation, ongoing care. The community rallied, raising money, offering support. But money couldn't erase what had happened. Couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't undo the trauma. Anger grew alongside fear. How could this happen? Where were the police? Why hadn't the gunman been caught? Las Cruces PD was under enormous pressure. The FBI was called in to assist. The case became national news. Reporters descended on the small city. America's Most Wanted featured the case. Composite sketches of the gunman were shown to millions of viewers. Tips flooded in from across the country. People who thought they recognized the sketches, who had theories about motive, who claimed to know who did it. Each tip was investigated. FBI agents and local detectives worked around the clock, following leads from California to Florida, chasing down reports of similar crimes, looking for patterns. But nothing panned out. The gunmen remained ghosts. And as weeks turned to months with no arrests, the community's fear began to mix with resignation. Maybe this was one of those cases, the kind that never gets solved, the kind where justice never comes. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your part of the world? Leave a comment and let me know. If you're interested in unsolved true crime cases like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Now let's continue with the investigation. The Las Cruces bowling alley case had a frustrating evidence problem. There was plenty of physical evidence. Bullet casings, fingerprints, DNA from the crime scene, but none of it led anywhere. The bullets were .22 caliber, a common ammunition. The gun itself was never found. Without the weapon, ballistics couldn't definitively link the bullets to other crimes or a specific firearm. The fingerprints recovered didn't match anyone in the database. In 1990, fingerprint databases were smaller, less comprehensive. If the gunman had no criminal record, their prints wouldn't be on file. DNA technology in 1990 was still relatively new. DNA was collected from the scene, but without suspects to compare it to, it sat in evidence storage, waiting for the day when someone could be identified. The money stolen was never recovered, wasn't spent in ways that could be traced. $5,000 can disappear easily, especially if you're patient. Spread it out over months. Use cash for everything. Never deposit it in a bank. The getaway vehicle, if there was one, was never identified. No witnesses saw the gunman get into a car. They simply ran from the bowling alley and vanished. The gray sweatshirt with Guys or Gus on it was never found. Despite searches and public appeals, no one came forward with information about where such a sweatshirt might have come from. It remained a tantalizing detail that led nowhere. This abundance of evidence that pointed nowhere frustrated investigators. They had physical proof the crime occurred. They had survivor testimony. They had composite sketches, but they couldn't connect it to actual people. Couldn't find the link that would crack the case open. Over the years, numerous suspects were investigated. Some looked promising initially, all led to dead ends. In 1990, a man was arrested in Texas on unrelated charges. He bragged to cellmates about committing a massacre in New Mexico. Police investigated, brought him in for questioning. His description didn't quite match the composite. His alibi for February 10, 1990, while not ironclad, was solid enough. The bragging appeared to be just that, a criminal trying to seem more dangerous than he was. He was ruled out. In 1995, a tip came in about two men who'd lived in Las Cruces in 1990 and suddenly left town right after the massacre. Investigators tracked them down in California, interviewed them, checked their fingerprints against evidence from the scene. No match. Their reason for leaving Las Cruces had nothing to do with the bowling alley. Another dead end. In 2000, a woman contacted police claiming her ex-husband had committed the crime, said he'd confessed to her during an argument. Investigators took this seriously, brought the ex-husband in. He denied everything. His appearance didn't match the description. His DNA didn't match evidence from the scene. The ex-wife admitted she was going through a bitter divorce and might have exaggerated what he'd said. No charges were filed. In 2007, a convicted killer in Arizona, facing death penalty, offered to confess to the Las Cruces massacre in exchange for a deal. Investigators flew to Arizona, interviewed him extensively. His confession contained details that hadn't been made public, which seemed promising. But it also contained details that were wrong. Things that didn't match the evidence. Further investigation revealed he'd researched the case, was trying to leverage it for a plea deal. He didn't do it. Just another dead end in a case that had become a graveyard of dead ends. Melissa Repasky survived the shooting in 1990, lived with a bullet fragment in her brain that couldn't be safely removed, suffered from seizures and headaches, but she survived. She testified against the gunman she couldn't identify, helped create the composite sketches, became a symbol of resilience in Las Cruces. She tried to live a normal life, graduated high school despite the challenges, got a job, tried to move forward. But trauma doesn't just disappear. The psychological scars ran deep. PTSD, survivor's guilt, depression, the weight of watching her mother die, of being shot herself, of living with the knowledge that the men who did it were still out there. On January 12, 1999, Melissa Repasky was found dead. She was 21 years old. The official cause of death was complications related to her brain injury from 1990. But those who knew her believed it was more than that. The trauma had never healed. The stress, the seizures, the constant reminder of what happened. Her death was delayed consequence of the massacre. A fifth victim 9 years later. Her death renewed attention to the case. Media coverage increased. Police renewed their appeals for information. But still, nothing concrete emerged. Melissa died without seeing justice for what had been done to her and her family. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. The community mourned again, remembered again, and grew angry again that after 9 years, the case remained unsolved. Detectives working the case felt Melissa's death personally. They'd known her, had worked with her, had promised her they'd find who did this, and they'd failed. The weight of that failure grew heavier with every year that passed. By the mid-2000s, the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre had officially become a cold case. Not closed, but no longer actively investigated with fresh leads. The file sat in Las Cruces Police Department's cold case division. Thousands of pages of reports. Evidence stored in boxes. Composite sketches that had been shown to millions but identified no one. Detective Steve Gallegos retired in 2009. He'd spent 19 years working the case, following every lead, interviewing hundreds of people, traveling across the country chasing tips. He retired without solving it. The failure haunted him. He told reporters he thought about the case every day, wondered if there was something he'd missed, some connection he hadn't made. New detectives took over, looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, pursued new theories, but the trail had gone cold decades ago. Witnesses had died or moved away. Memories had faded. Physical evidence had been tested with every available technology and yielded nothing. The 20th anniversary in 2010 brought renewed media attention. Interviews with survivors, retrospectives on the case, new composite sketches created using age progression technology, showing what the gunman might look like 20 years older. New tip lines established, and tips did come in. But they were the same tips that had been investigated before. The same suspects who'd already been ruled out. The same dead ends. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Another tragic mystery. Another crime where the guilty escape justice. Another reminder that not every case gets a resolution. But some people refuse to give up. In 2016, Las Cruces Police Department announced they were using new DNA technology to re-examine evidence from the massacre. Advances in genetic genealogy, the same techniques that had started solving decades-old cold cases across the country, offered new hope. DNA from the crime scene would be run through genealogical databases. The idea was to find familial matches, people related to the gunmen who'd submitted their DNA to ancestry websites. Use those connections to build family trees and identify suspects. It was a long shot. The DNA evidence from 1990 was degraded, not pristine, and the technique required the gunman to have relatives who'd used ancestry services. But it was something, a new avenue when all others had been exhausted. The announcement generated excitement in Las Cruces. Survivors and victims' families dared to hope that maybe, finally, science could do what traditional detective work hadn't managed. But progress was slow. The DNA analysis took time. The database searches took time. Building family trees from partial matches took time. And as months turned to years, the initial excitement faded. The technology was promising, but the Las Cruces case presented unique challenges. The DNA samples were limited. The matches in databases were inconclusive. By 2019, investigators admitted that while they hadn't given up on the genetic genealogy approach, it hadn't yet produced the breakthrough they'd hoped for. The case remained unsolved. The technology that had caught the Golden State Killer and dozens of other cold case murderers hadn't cracked Las Cruces. Not yet, maybe never, but they kept trying. Because what else could they do? For people dead, 8 wounded, families destroyed, a community traumatized. Somewhere, the gunmen were still out there, still free, still unpunished, and that was unacceptable. Paula Holguin was 6 years old when she was shot in the head at Las Cruces Bowl. She survived. Her mother Ida survived. Her sister Melissa survived initially, though she died 9 years later. Paula grew up as a survivor, a victim, someone defined by the worst day of her life. The brain injury affected her. Cognitive difficulties, memory problems, seizures. She required ongoing medical care and support throughout her childhood. But she also showed remarkable resilience. She graduated from high school, learned to manage her condition, tried to build a life beyond being a massacre survivor. In interviews over the years, Paula spoke about the burden of survival. People recognized her, knew her story. Some treated her with pity, others with morbid curiosity. She couldn't escape what had happened. It had literally changed the structure of her brain, affected how she learned, how she processed information, how she lived. She spoke about wanting justice, about the frustration of knowing the people who did this were still out there, possibly living normal lives, possibly laughing and breathing and doing all the things her mother Stephanie and Stephen Turan and Melissa would never do again. But she also spoke about not letting it define her, about being more than a victim, about finding meaning and purpose despite the trauma. Her resilience inspired others. Survivors of violence reached out to her, found strength in her story. But Paula was clear that survival wasn't triumph. It was just survival, getting through each day, managing the pain, physical and psychological, trying to find moments of peace in a life forever marked by violence. She became an advocate for victims' rights, spoke at events, pushed for better support services for survivors, made meaning from horror in the only way she could, by trying to help others avoid or cope with similar trauma. As the case entered its fourth decade unsolved, investigators and true crime researchers revisited old theories and developed new ones. The serial killer theory gained traction in some circles. Could the bowling alley massacre have been committed by a serial killer or killers who struck elsewhere? Researchers compared the Las Cruces case to other unsolved mass shootings from the late 1980s and early 1990s, looking for patterns. Similar methodology, similar victim selection. Some pointed to other cases. A shooting in a restaurant in upstate New York in 1991. A home invasion in Texas in 1989. Similar brutality. Similar execution-style killings. Similar lack of obvious motive. But the connections were tenuous. The details didn't quite match. Law enforcement agencies communicated, compared evidence, found no definitive links. The drug cartel theory persisted. Las Cruces' location made it relevant to trafficking routes. Some investigators believed the bowling alley might have been used as a money laundering front, that the massacre was a message or a punishment. But again, no evidence supported this. No connection to cartels was ever established. A newer theory suggested the crime was committed by someone in law enforcement or military. The calm, methodical nature of the shooting, the execution-style kills, the ability to disappear completely afterward. This fit a profile of someone with training. Someone who knew how to commit violence efficiently, how to avoid leaving trace evidence, how to vanish. Investigators looked at current and former military personnel in the Las Cruces area in 1990. Former police officers, people with tactical training, found no credible suspects. The personal vendetta theory remained viable. Perhaps someone had a grudge so deep against Stephanie or Stephen that they were willing to commit mass murder to eliminate their target and all witnesses. But who? And why? After 3 decades of investigation, no personal enemy had been identified. No motive that made sense. Every theory had adherents. Every theory had problems. And none brought investigators any closer to actual suspects. February 10, 2020, marked 30 years since the massacre. Las Cruces held a memorial service. Survivors attended. Families of victims. Community members who remembered. Law enforcement officers who'd worked the case. The event was somber, reflective, angry. How had 3 decades passed without justice? How had the gunman escaped for so long? Police Chief Patrick Gallagher spoke at the memorial, assured the community that the case remained active, that new leads were still being pursued, that they would never give up. But his words felt hollow to some. 30 years. An entire generation had grown up in Las Cruces knowing about the massacre. Children born after 1990 were now adults with children of their own. And still no arrests. Still no answers. Media coverage of the anniversary was extensive. Local news stations did retrospectives. National crime shows revisited the case. The composite sketches were shown again. The timeline was reviewed. Survivor interviews were conducted. And tips came in. The anniversary always generated tips. People who'd been silent for years suddenly remembered something, or thought they did, or wanted to be part of the story. Each tip was investigated. Even 30 years later, police followed every lead. But as with every anniversary before, the renewed attention produced no breakthrough. Just more disappointment, more frustration, more grief. Paula Holguin spoke at the memorial, now 36 years old. She stood where her mother and sister had stood at previous anniversaries, spoke about the ongoing impact, the lives forever changed, the justice forever denied. She made a plea. If you know something, anything, please come forward. 30 years is too long to carry a secret this heavy. 30 years is too long for killers to walk free. 30 years is too long for families to wait for answers. Her words were powerful, emotional, but whether they reached anyone who actually knew something, no one could say. Investigators have long believed they know who committed the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre. Or at least they have strong suspicions. But suspicion isn't evidence. Belief isn't proof. Two names have circulated in law enforcement circles for years, names that have never been publicly released. Men who were in Las Cruces in 1990, who fit the general description, who had histories of violence, who left the area shortly after the massacre and have since died. One supposedly died in the mid-1990s in a car accident, the other in the early 2000s of natural causes. If they are the gunmen, they escaped justice, died without ever being held accountable, without ever confessing, without giving survivors and families the closure of knowing for certain. Some investigators are convinced these men did it, point to circumstantial evidence, behavior patterns, connections to the bowling alley. But the evidence isn't strong enough for a prosecutor to have ever filed charges when the men were alive. And now they're dead, so charges are impossible. This is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the case. The possibility that justice was within reach and slipped away. That the men responsible lived free for years and then died peacefully, never facing consequences. If this theory is correct, the case will never officially be solved. Because you can't prosecute the dead. Can't convict corpses. The most that could happen is police announcing they believe they've identified the killers based on evidence, even though charges were never filed. Some families would take that, would accept knowing the who even without the why, would find some closure in identification even without conviction. But others would find it hollow, unsatisfying. How can you accept that justice meant the killers dying of old age or accidents while your loved ones died violently at their hands? It's not justice. It's not even close. It's just the universe's cruel randomness. The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre remains officially unsolved. The case file remains open. In a locked room at Las Cruces Police Department, boxes of evidence sit on shelves, waiting for new technology, for a deathbed confession, for someone's guilty conscience to finally speak, for DNA to match, for anything to break the case open after more than 3 decades. The survivors are now in their 40s and 50s. Paula Holguin continues her advocacy work. Amy Hauser lives quietly, still dealing with the effects of her brain injury. Ida Holguin has never recovered her memories of that day. Valerie Turan grew up and learned about what happened to her father and herself. The families of Stephanie Senak and Stephen Turan still grieve, still wait for answers, still hope that before they die, they'll know who killed their loved ones and why. Detectives still assigned to the case still work it, still follow up on tips, still review evidence, still hope for the breakthrough that will let them close one of New Mexico's most notorious unsolved crimes. The community of Las Cruces still remembers. The bowling alley building still stands, though it's no longer a bowling alley. People still drive past and remember. Parents still tell their children about it. A reminder that terrible things can happen anywhere, to anyone, at any time. And that sometimes, despite our best efforts, justice remains elusive. The story of the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre is a story without an ending. A question without an answer. A wound that won't heal. For people dead. 8 wounded. 2 gunmen who vanished. And 30-plus years of investigation that has produced theories, suspects, possibilities, but never certainty. Never justice. It stands as one of America's most brutal unsolved crimes. A reminder that evil sometimes wins. That violence sometimes goes unpunished. That there are mysteries that resist every effort to solve them. If you know something about this case, contact the Las Cruces Police Department. Even after all these years, they're still listening, still investigating, still hoping, because the survivors deserve answers. The dead deserve justice. And somewhere, someone knows what happened on that February morning in 1990. This case will never truly be closed until that someone speaks. Thank you for listening to this difficult story. If you're interested in unsolved cases like this, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Share this video. Keep the story alive, because attention creates pressure, and pressure can make people talk. The survivors of Las Cruces are still waiting. Let's make sure they're not forgotten. On a warm morning in March 2003, Guangzhou was already awake. Buses moved through the streets with their usual patience, shops lifted metal shutters, and office workers blended into the slow rhythm of a weekday. Nothing about the city suggested that a single ordinary day would soon become one of the most discussed moments in modern Chinese legal history. Sun Jigang was 27 years old. He had recently graduated from university and had come to Guangzhou to begin work as a designer. Like many young professionals, he was trying to find his footing in a fast-moving city. He rented modest housing, carried identification, and focused on building a future that felt quietly promising. That morning, Sun stepped out to run a simple errand. He carried himself like someone thinking about deadlines and daily routines rather than danger. There was no indication that his name would soon be known across the country. Not far from where he walked, police were conducting routine checks under a system known as custody and repatriation. The policy allowed authorities to detain people who could not immediately prove local residency. It had existed for years and was rarely questioned by the public. Sun was stopped. He explained who he was. He had identification, but confusion followed. A misunderstanding, a delay, a decision that could not be undone. Instead of continuing his day, Sun Jigang was taken into custody. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, take a moment to notice the time. Is it late at night or early morning? These stories often reach people when the world is quiet. If this is your first time here, you're welcome. You can listen without tension, without urgency. Just stay with the story. Sun was transferred between facilities. Each place followed procedures that felt routine to those inside the system. Forms were filled. Names were written. Doors opened and closed. No alarms were raised. No one imagined that within days, everything would change. Inside the detention center, time moved differently. For those held there, hours stretched longer than they should. Sun was now part of a system that rarely explained itself to the people inside it. 3 days later, Sun Jigang was taken to a hospital. By the end of that day, he was gone. The official explanation came quickly, too quickly. And for Sun's family, it raised more questions than answers. What happened in those 3 days? And why would this single case soon force an entire nation to look at a law that had existed for decades? When Sun Jigang's family received the news, it arrived wrapped in formal language. The explanation was brief, clinical, and distant. It described a sudden medical issue. It suggested inevitability. It left no space for doubt. But doubt was exactly what followed. Sun's family asked for clarity. They requested details. They wanted to understand how a healthy young man could be gone after only 3 days in custody. What they received instead were delays and contradictions. Medical records did not align. Timelines felt incomplete. Small details refused to settle into place. As word spread, journalists began to notice. Legal scholars quietly reviewed the case. Online forums, still new at the time, filled with careful questions rather than anger. People weren't shouting yet. They were thinking. If you're listening from Nigeria, India, Europe, or anywhere else, pause for a second. What time is it where you are right now? Stories like this travel far because they ask questions that matter everywhere. If this kind of calm, thoughtful storytelling helps you unwind, consider subscribing, liking the video, and turning on notifications. It helps the channel stay steady and ad-free for listeners like you. An independent autopsy was requested. When the findings became known, they did not match the original explanation. The difference was impossible to ignore. Now the story shifted. This was no longer only about Sun Jigang. It became about authority, accountability, and the space between written law and lived reality. Lawyers began discussing the custody system openly, something that rarely happened before. At the center of it all was a simple question. How could someone be detained legally, yet still be unprotected? As pressure grew, officials responded carefully. Statements were revised. Responsibility became vague. No single person stood clearly in front of the truth. Meanwhile, Sun's name continued to circulate, not loudly, not emotionally, but persistently. This case did something unusual. It made people read the law. They looked at regulations that had existed quietly for years. They noticed how easily they could affect anyone. And slowly, the focus moved away from what happened in one detention center toward whether the system itself could continue to exist. Cliffhanger. What began as a personal tragedy was now turning into a legal reckoning, one that could not be undone. By April 2003, the case of Sun Jigang had crossed a line. It was no longer confined to courtrooms or newspaper columns. It had entered public consciousness. 3 legal scholars took an unprecedented step. They formally challenged the custody and repatriation system, arguing that it violated constitutional protections. This had rarely been done before, and never with such public attention. The timing mattered. Public trust was already fragile. People were paying attention. And for the first time, a law that once felt permanent looked uncertain. As discussions unfolded, officials faced a difficult choice: defend the system fully or admit it could no longer stand. If you're still listening, let me ask gently, where are you listening from tonight and what time is it there? Many listeners share that these moments of reflection help them fall asleep. If this story resonates, a simple like or subscription quietly supports more careful, respectful true crime like this. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. The language of reform began to appear. Statements became more precise. Accountability, once avoided, was now unavoidable. In June 2003, the custody and repatriation system was officially abolished. It had taken the death of one young man to dismantle a nationwide policy. Those responsible were prosecuted. The case entered history books. But the most important impact was less visible. It changed how citizens understood their rights and how law could be questioned. Sun Jigang never became a symbol by choice, but his name would forever be linked to change. Yet even with reform, questions remained. Could this have been prevented? How many others had suffered quietly before? And what safeguards truly protect ordinary people? After the news of Sun Jigang's death and the questions surrounding it spread, citizens began discussing it quietly but persistently. Newspapers printed editorials cautiously. Online forums, still new at the time, debated what had happened. People shared stories about encounters with bureaucracy, moments when rules felt inflexible or unfair. It was not a loud outcry at first. It was a quiet reflection. Neighbors talking in the evenings, families considering what might happen if one of their own were in Sun's place. Many felt a strange mixture of sorrow and unease. The legal world, however, could not ignore the case. Scholars studied how a law intended to manage residency had been applied to someone with identification, someone law-abiding and ordinary. Articles questioned the balance of power, the protections meant to shield citizens, and the human cost when those safeguards failed. At this point, if you are listening, consider your own surroundings. Is it late at night, the hours before sleep, or early morning? Where you are, the world feels quiet, and this story can be a reminder that laws touch people everywhere, even when unnoticed. If you appreciate this calm narration, consider subscribing, liking the video, and turning on notifications. It helps stories like this reach listeners around the world without distraction. The case began to gain momentum in legal circles. Reports suggested that authorities were re-examining the events leading to Sun's detention. People asked questions about detention facilities, oversight, and the accountability of officials. For many, this was a chance to see change through careful attention rather than loud protest. And yet, the questions remained unanswered in everyday life. Families continued to wonder, how could a single day, a short detention, lead to such a tragedy? How many similar cases had gone unnoticed? The group of legal scholars who reviewed Sun Jigang's case began publishing analyses and papers. They explained the custody and repatriation system in calm, detailed language. They highlighted inconsistencies, questioned the interpretation of laws, and made the subtle but firm point. This was not just a personal tragedy. It was a system in need of scrutiny. Their work did not scream for attention. It was methodical, precise, and aimed at understanding, rather than emotion. But the effect was profound. It reached journalists, academics, and eventually government officials who could no longer ignore the scrutiny. Listeners, if you are hearing this now, perhaps in a quiet bedroom or late at night, think about how small actions ripple out. Consider sharing where you are listening from and what time it is. It's a small gesture that connects people across distances. And if you haven't yet, a like or subscription helps keep this channel calm, informative, and uninterrupted. As discussions unfolded, officials faced a difficult choice: defend a decades-old system that had rarely been questioned, or acknowledge the very real flaws exposed by a single death. For the first time, policy seemed mutable, and ordinary citizens could see that their voices, combined with careful research, mattered. The scholars' writings also encouraged ordinary people to examine their. By early summer of 2003, the case had reached the eyes of lawmakers. The National People's Congress began reviewing the custody and repatriation regulations for the first time in decades. Debate was careful, deliberate, and quiet, but the pressure was undeniable. Sun Jigang's story was cited repeatedly as the reason for reform. Citizens, journalists, and legal scholars followed the developments. Slowly, the narrative shifted from a single man's death to a larger examination of rights and protections. The law, which had existed as a background mechanism, was now in the spotlight. Listeners, if you are in the United States, Europe, Africa, or anywhere else, notice the quiet world around you as this story unfolds. Where are you listening? What time is it? Taking note of these small details connects you to the story in a calm, grounding way. And again, subscribing or liking ensures stories like this reach others seeking the same quiet reflection. The government faced criticism from legal experts. Many pointed out that detaining someone with proper identification should never have happened. Citizens discussed fairness, oversight, and accountability. Slowly, momentum built for change. Despite the attention, the system did not collapse immediately. Officials debated internally, and outside, citizens waited quietly. Families like Sun's watched closely, hoping their loss would lead to meaningful change for others. As the story of Sun Jigang spread across the country, ordinary citizens began to reflect on the events quietly. Conversations took place in living rooms, workplaces, and cafes. People considered how a law designed for order could unexpectedly affect someone like Sun, a young man following the rules, simply living his life. Journalists wrote cautiously, using measured language to explain the custody and repatriation system. They outlined the process, the administrative steps, and the gaps in protection. Newspapers published letters from readers expressing concern and empathy, but also a desire for change. Listeners, wherever you are right now, take a moment to notice your surroundings. What time is it? Is it calm and quiet, perfect for listening without rush? If this narration helps you feel grounded, consider subscribing, liking the video, or turning on notifications. These small actions help keep these stories accessible and uninterrupted for everyone. Legal scholars encouraged public debate, reminding citizens that laws are meant to serve the people, not endanger them. Slowly, the idea of reform entered collective consciousness. People questioned whether policies like custody and repatriation were still appropriate in modern cities, especially as migration increased. While the public discussion grew, the government remained cautious. Officials considered the possibility of modifying the law or abolishing it entirely. The death of the legal scholars who had examined Sun Jigang's death continued their work quietly but deliberately. They prepared a detailed legal challenge, examining the custody and repatriation system for inconsistencies, contradictions, and violations of citizen rights. Their goal was not to create chaos, but to ensure justice and accountability. Each paper was carefully written, every reference checked, and every argument framed in precise language. The intention was clear. A single death should not be forgotten, and the law should protect, not harm, citizens. If you are listening tonight, perhaps in a quiet bedroom or on a calm evening walk, notice how the world around you feels still. What time is it there? Sharing your location or time in the comments helps others feel connected to the story across cities and countries. And if you enjoy this narration, consider subscribing or liking. It supports ongoing storytelling without unnecessary interruptions. The scholar's work began to attract attention in legal circles. Lawyers, academics, and even some government officials started discussing the arguments openly. What had once been a background law, rarely questioned, was now a topic of public review. Even with growing attention, questions remained. How could such a system exist without clear oversight? How many others had been quietly affected before Sun Jigang's case? And most importantly, would the system truly change, or would reform remain on paper? By mid-2003, the government issued its first official statements regarding Sun Jigang's death. The language was careful, formal, and cautious. Officials acknowledged the tragedy but avoided assigning direct blame. The statement highlighted the need for review, subtly indicating that change might be considered. Citizens listened closely, analyzing every word, every phrase. Lawyers and scholars studied the wording, noting the implications and the possible next steps. If you are listening now, take a moment to notice where you are. Is it late at night or early morning? The quiet hours allow stories like this to reach you fully, without distraction. Consider subscribing, liking, or turning on notifications to continue following these reflective narratives safely. Despite the careful wording, public trust began to shift. People realized that a law long considered routine could be questioned, and that ordinary citizens, scholars, and journalists could influence the conversation. The death of Sun Jigang had opened a door few expected. Even as discussions continued, the system itself remained unchanged for the moment. Detention centers were still operating, and authorities continued their routines. But behind the scenes, debates and preparations for reform were underway. By the summer of 2003, momentum for change reached its peak. Legal challenges, public discussion, and scholarly analysis had combined into a compelling argument for reform. The government could no longer delay its response. The National People's Congress began reviewing the custody and repatriation system carefully. Officials examined each step, each procedural rule, and each potential weakness in oversight. Sun Jigang's case became the central reference point, demonstrating the human cost of administrative error. Listeners, if you are hearing this in the quiet of the night, take a moment to notice your breathing, the calm around you, and the time where you are. Sharing this helps connect our global audience. And if this channel provides a peaceful listening experience, consider subscribing or liking. It helps maintain calm, uninterrupted narration. As debates continued, officials weighed options. Abolishing the system entirely would be unprecedented. Reforming it incrementally might leave gaps. The decision was complex, but everyone understood one truth. Sun Jigang's story could not be ignored. Public interest remained steady but calm. Citizens read newspaper updates, engaged in quiet discussions, and followed legal developments carefully. The nation watched, not with anger or outcry, but with thoughtful attention, reflecting on fairness, law, and protection. By late summer 2003, Sun Jigang's case had sparked more than debate. It had reached the halls of government where the law itself was under close examination. Legal committees reviewed the custody and repatriation system line by line, looking for inconsistencies, vulnerabilities, and human costs. The discussions were quiet but thorough. Officials debated the necessity of the law, the safeguards in place, and whether it aligned with the principles of fairness and citizen protection. Documents were studied carefully, meetings were held behind closed doors, and the pressure of public attention, though calm, was undeniable. Listeners, wherever you are tonight, consider the stillness around you. What time is it where you are? Quiet moments allow us to think and reflect on stories like this. If you enjoy this calm storytelling, a like, subscription, or turning on notifications helps keep more narratives flowing gently into your space. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens continued to follow developments. Families read the newspaper in the mornings, discussed the situation in the evenings, and watched how reform might impact life in cities like Guangzhou. The case had become a mirror reflecting the broader relationship between individuals and the law. Even as committees debated, legal scholars prepared summaries and recommendations. Their work emphasized that laws exist to protect citizens, not endanger them. Each suggestion was practical, measured, and aimed at ensuring tragedies like Sunjigangs would not happen again. As the government quietly debated, citizens remained engaged in their own subtle ways. Letters were written, comments were posted online, and conversations continued over tea or late-night dinners. People considered what fairness and accountability meant, not as abstract ideas, but in the context of one young man's life cut short. Journalists reported steadily, without sensationalism, focusing on facts and measured commentary. The narrative emphasized understanding rather than anger. It highlighted procedural issues and the need for transparency, which quietly encouraged people to consider how systems affect everyday life. Listeners, take a moment to notice your surroundings. Where are you listening and what time is it? Moments like these, when the world is calm, allow us to follow stories carefully, letting understanding settle rather than rushing to judgment. And if you value this type of calm narration, subscribing, liking, or turning on notifications helps sustain this channel for sleep-friendly storytelling. Legal scholars continued to submit reports, and officials began incorporating feedback. Citizens watched with patience, observing how the system, once seemingly rigid, could bend when enough careful attention was given. The story of Sun Jigang became a lesson in vigilance, reflection, and the quiet power of reasoned advocacy. In late 2003, the discussions within government reached a pivotal point. For the first time, officials publicly acknowledged that the custody and repatriation system might need to be abolished entirely. Legal scholars emphasized that reform alone might leave gaps, and Sun Jigang's case had made those gaps painfully clear. The proposal was carefully worded, emphasizing order, fairness, and protection. Committees drafted recommendations with the goal of ensuring that no citizen could be detained arbitrarily or harmed by administrative oversight. The language was cautious, neutral, and deliberate, reflecting the careful process required for change. Listeners, wherever you are, notice the quiet world around you. Consider what time it is, and let the stillness guide your mind as the story unfolds. Subscribing, liking, or turning on notifications allows more stories like this to reach calm, reflective listeners around the world. The proposal sparked measured discussion in public and legal circles. Citizens considered what it meant for their rights, their families, and the future of the law. Scholars emphasized that the human cost of the previous system could not be ignored, and that Sun Jigang's story had become the catalyst for a fundamental shift. By early 2004, the moment had arrived. Officials formally voted to abolish the custody and repatriation system, ending a policy that had existed for decades. Sun Jigang's case had become a defining moment, demonstrating the importance of oversight, accountability, and the protection of individual rights. The announcement was calm, almost understated, but its impact was profound. Citizens, legal scholars, and journalists recognized that a significant shift had occurred. A single death had prompted a nationwide change, altering how ordinary people would be treated by administrative systems in the future. Listeners, as you hear this now, take a deep breath and notice your surroundings. Where are you and what time is it? Quiet reflection helps absorb stories like these without tension. If this narration brings calm, consider subscribing or liking. It helps sustain sleep-friendly storytelling globally. The law's abolition marked a turning point. Beyond procedural adjustments, it symbolized a new awareness that laws must serve the people, not the other way around. Families and ordinary citizens felt reassurance that tragedies like Sun Jigang's could be prevented with oversight, transparency, and accountability. Yet even with this resolution, questions lingered. How many others had suffered quietly before? Could society ensure that reforms were consistently applied? And how could citizens remain vigilant in the future? When the custody and repatriation system was abolished, daily life continued quietly across China. Streets remained busy, buses followed their routes, and people went to work as they always had. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. For many citizens, the change felt subtle. There was no dramatic announcement in everyday life, no sudden transformation of routine. but the knowledge that a long-standing policy had been removed because of one man's death stayed with people. It lingered in conversations, in classrooms, and in legal discussions. Legal professionals began reassessing other administrative regulations. Sun Jigang's case became a reference point in law schools and training sessions, not as a symbol of outrage, but as an example of how oversight matters. The message was quiet but clear. Systems must be questioned, even when they seem ordinary. If you're listening now, somewhere in the world where the day has slowed down, take a moment to notice the time. Is it late night or early morning for you? Stories like this often find listeners in quiet hours. If this narration helps you unwind, consider subscribing or liking the video. It supports more calm, thoughtful storytelling like this. For Sun's family, life moved forward, but the absence remained. The law had changed, but their loss could not be undone. What they carried forward was the knowledge that their son's story had helped prevent future harm. Following the abolition of the system, attention returned to those directly involved in Sun Jigang's detention. Investigations continued quietly, focusing on procedural failures and individual responsibility. The process was slow and methodical. Several officials were held accountable. Court proceedings emphasized due process and legality, rather than emotion. The outcome signaled that negligence within administrative systems would not be ignored. For the public, this phase mattered deeply. It demonstrated that reform was not only symbolic. It also involved consequences, even if they arrived without spectacle. Listeners, wherever you are resting right now, notice how quiet accountability can be powerful. What time is it where you are? If this kind of measured storytelling resonates, turning on notifications ensures you won't miss future episodes designed for calm listening. The case continued to appear in legal discussions, reminding professionals that authority carries responsibility. The lessons were clear. Identification must be respected, detention must be justified, and human dignity must never be treated as secondary. Cliffhanger. The case was closing legally, but its influence was only beginning to unfold. Years passed, and Sun Jigang's name entered textbooks and lectures. Law students studied the case as an example of constitutional review and administrative reform. It was discussed not as a dramatic tragedy, but as a turning point in legal awareness. Professors explained how 3 scholars, working carefully and lawfully, had challenged an entire system. Students listened quietly, understanding that meaningful change often begins with patience, research, and clarity. For society, this mattered. It showed that reform doesn't always come from loud voices, but from consistent reasoning and moral responsibility. If you're listening tonight from Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, pause for a moment. Where are you and what time is it? Many listeners share these stories during their quietest hours. A simple like or subscription helps keep this space calm and uninterrupted. Cliffhanger. But how would future generations remember Sun Jigang, not just as a case, but as a human being? Unlike many widely known cases, Sun Jigang's story was remembered without monuments or public ceremonies. There were no annual events or official memorials. Instead, his remembrance lived in documents, reforms, and awareness. This quiet remembrance suited the nature of the case. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about responsibility, reflection, and prevention. Families across the country felt a subtle reassurance knowing that administrative detention had changed. Migrant workers, students, and travelers carried identification with less fear of misunderstanding. Listeners, as your surroundings grow quieter, notice how silence can hold meaning. What time is it now for you? If this narration brings a sense of calm, consider supporting the channel with a like or notification. It allows more peaceful storytelling to continue. Sun Jigang's case left behind more than legal reform. It left a shift in public awareness. Citizens understood that laws were not fixed forever, and that careful questioning could lead to protection rather than punishment. The media also changed. Journalists became more attentive to administrative cases, knowing their reporting could influence accountability. Scholars continued analyzing how policy intersects with human life. For many, the case became a reminder. Ordinary days can change unexpectedly, and systems must be built to protect people during those moments. If you're still listening, perhaps close to sleep now, notice your breathing and the quiet around you. Where are you and what time is it? Sharing these moments connects listeners across the world. Subscribing or liking helps keep this space steady and calm. The story of Sun Jigang does not end with celebration or closure. It ends quietly, much like it began, with an ordinary young man living his life. His legacy lives in a law that no longer exists, in safeguards that replaced it, and in the awareness that systems must always be questioned with care and humanity. For listeners, this case offers a gentle reminder. Progress is often slow, quiet, and built on reflection rather than noise. One life can change many, even without intention. As this story comes to a close, take a moment to notice where you are and what time it is. If you've listened through the night or into the early hours, thank you for being here. If you haven't already, consider subscribing, liking the video, and turning on notifications. It helps more calm, respectful true crime stories reach listeners seeking rest and understanding. The story fades not with answers, but with awareness. And sometimes awareness is enough.